You're listening to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. Welcome back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Geraghty. I'm a screenwriter, filmmaker, and the creator and founder of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. Each week, I sit down with an artist or creative to talk about what inspires them, what their creative process is like, and how Paris plays into it all. My guest this week is writer and musician Samuél Lopez-Barrantes. Samuel teaches creative writing at the Sorbonne and hosts literary walks and virtual salons in Paris. He was in the American folk rock trio Slim and the Beast, and he recently released a limited edition of his second novel, The Requisitions. Hello, Samuel. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jennifer.
I am really looking forward to talking to you. I know that you do many, many different things. So can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself? Who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, so I guess, I'm primarily a novelist. I spend a lot of my time writing books that may or may not get seen by anybody else. But I'm also a musician. I was in a band called Slim and the Beast for 7 years in Paris. And that band's name was actually based on the novel that I first published in 2015 called Slim and the Beast. So the book kind of became a band, and now I've just published a second novel called The Requisitions. And I'd say I'm a novelist who plays piano and sings as well. But I've lived in Paris since 2010, worked various odd jobs.
Me too.
Wow. Is it 14? Yeah, 14 years now. As soon as I graduated from the University of Vermont, I just hopped on a plane and I came back to write my first novel and be with my partner at the time. And the book sucked and the relationship ended, and then life began. So I've been doing all the things you do, to make ends meet when you first start out. Teaching English for a while. Then I was a glorified receptionist where I got to write an early draft of the Requisitions, which just came out. And I've settled now, at least for the time being, on a literary tour guide. And I teach creative writing at the Sorbonne. And I run a Paris writers salon. And that allows me to kind of mix and match the mosaic style with some writing on Substack as well, and keep on living cheaply and flâner, as the French say. Yeah.
Living the Parisian dream, as it were.
Someone's got to do it. So,
well, there was a lot in there, so I want to dig through some of that. But can we go back to the beginning? So I read that you were born in France to a Spanish father and an American mother. When you think of home or your hometown, what do you think of?
Paris now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I kind of adopted it quickly, but Chapel Hill and Durham are really where my childhood took place. And I don't think of that as home anymore, largely because a lot of my friends no longer live there. My mom still lives in Chapel Hill, but my dad left when I went to college, and a lot of our friends did the same. So it's of the past, at least in my kind of relationship to it now. I still enjoy going back, but it's more to reconnect with old friends and kind of old memories than it is to have any future endeavors, as it were. So Paris really has been my home since 2010.
Had you been here before then?
So I studied abroad in 2008 for a year. So that was my first introduction. And I had visited as a kid a couple times, I think, probably twice maybe in my first 18 years on the planet. But I didn't know much about it until I really lived here as a student and then more properly as a young professional.
Would you have called yourself a Francophile before you came here?
Yeah, I loved learning French. Even in high school, I took it as an elective just because I wanted to learn it. And I was always kind of fascinated by French history, specifically or during World War II. And I had a connection to that insofar as where we were born in the south of France, there's a little placard that says one of the leaders of the resistance in that area was executed by the Gestapo in front of the building. So, past lives, who knows, maybe being born next to that building had a connection to my interest in the subject, but I always wanted to study French history, French literature, specifically philosophy as well. I read Camus when I was in college and really connected to absurdism, and then Samuel Beckett, and then, of course, Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre, and even Maupassant. I loved French literature. It's they do it in a way that I respond to. So I was definitely more Francophile than your average 17-year-old, that's for sure.
Did you ever consider becoming a philosopher in so much as someone can become a philosopher?
Yeah, I studied it kind of, I did a dual degree really in kind of philosophy, history in undergrad, but my romanticism of academia was in direct inverse correlation to the amount of time I spent in it. So after 2 masters, I was fully done with that. Actually, the second master's was mostly to kind of correct my bad choice in the first. So philosophy, no, yeah. I mean, yes, in the sense that I actually do, this is not really kind of a poetic statement. I do believe that real philosophers don't make a living from it. It's a way of life. It's a way of certainly sitting with people, thinking with yourself. And Paris lends itself to that. Of course, the terrace culture. There is really something philosophical about life in Paris that isn't about academia or intellect, really. It's just about thinking about life. That's what philosophy really is to me. So I am a philosopher without even knowing it.
I agree with you. There's something about Paris or the French and the culture that lends itself to sort of teasing out the larger questions and debating different sides of some sort of premise, whether or not you agree with it, just to see what happens if you pursue a line of thinking.
Yeah, I'm sure you experience that similar amount of time here. I mean, in day-to-day conversations, right? You can get into deep stuff quickly without it being like emotional or religious or political, but just real human questions that, yeah, I love it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also think that there's less of an attachment to being stuck on a particular idea or a philosophy. Like you can really just ruminate and speak out loud and debate these things without having to have one set philosophy that is just yours forever.
I agree. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think one of the big aspects of American culture, at least in the last couple decades, is this growing sense that any idea you have or opinion becomes your identity, and you have to all of a sudden defend your entire life because of something you discuss in an argument or say, or God forbid, say something that you then realize was either wrong or you no longer believe in. The French don't have that same approach. I don't think. It's an older country, an older history, and I think there's a bit more malleability when it comes to the complexity of ideas than, I mean, America's a puritanical nation, right? There's very clear right and wrong. 10 years ago, you smoke weed in the street, you are going to be thrown in jail. Certain states, you can still have that happen to you. But now there are 1,000 startups saying how they're going to save your life with CBD oils and THC. It's the best thing you can do for your health. It's crazy to me how quickly in the US the pendulum goes from one moral evil to a absolute good, which the French definitely don't. It takes them a while to decide whether or not something new is going to be actually good.
Yeah, I agree, which sometimes is to their detriment. But I agree that the gray area in the middle is the more interesting place to explore.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking back to yourself as a child, what came first? Your love of writing, your love of music, or your love of basketball?
Wow. The third one you really threw in. I had the answer until the third one. I think probably my love of basketball came first because my brother and I, being a twin brother, I mean, we played that since we were 3 or 4. But once I could write even a sentence, which was 5 or 6, then writing became really a way to separate myself from my brother first and foremost, because reading and writing allowed me to be in my room or to be by myself in my head in a way that, to this day, if you say I'm reading or writing, people don't bother you. Pretty much any other act you're doing, people feel kind of like, okay, well, let's have a conversation. So I loved reading and writing from a young age because I could explore the worlds in my head. C.S. Lewis and Harry Potter were huge influences. Shel Silverstein, Gary Larson, Far Side, all these. But basketball, certainly. I mean, I always think of it as a yin and yang. Even today, I was just climbing at a gym. I just started bouldering because I find in order to write well or to be in a mindset to be able to think deeply, I also need to have a space where I can be very physical and in my body versus my head. And the more I exercise, the better I write. So writing and sports certainly have been the primary drivers, but music was a close third. I played piano as a kid, and my parents are voice teachers, so I sang as a kid. But it's not as I can go a week maybe without the real need or urge, and then I remember, I really should play some piano. Very rare for me to go a week without reading, no way, and without writing, very rare.
I was going to ask you whether your parents encouraged your creativity as a child, but it sounds like they did.
They did, and they're both artists. My mom's a playwright, Ellen Hemphill. Dozens of plays she wrote while she was teaching at Duke University throughout the years. And my father, Rafael Lopez-Barrantes, is a theater director and professor. He teaches at Cal Arts, and you know, they kind of knew they were raising two kids who were going to probably leave the country at some point and also pursue things that were not going to necessarily pay the bills for the whole family, so to speak. But, you know, apple doesn't fall far from the tree when it comes to artists, that's for sure.
You mentioned before your first book, Slim and the Beast. Mm-hmm. Was this a book you said you've been writing since you were very young? Was this the book that you had been gestating in the back of your mind?
No, so this actually, when I first moved in 2010, I started writing this kind of sweeping American critique and satire of a presidential candidate who had a huge ego and used pharmaceuticals to take control of the country and then cause fear to then treat it. So it had some foreshadowing to
yeah. I wonder where you got that from.
Exactly. So I was writing that in 2010 and 11, but it was not a good novel and I gave it up. And then, of course, after spending 2 years and change on a novel that I was convinced was the good one and writing it the way I thought novels should be written, in 3 months, I just wrote a draft of a book that came out of me about these two teenagers in North Carolina, Slim and the Beast, a war veteran and a basketball player. And it just kind of came. I had a vision in my head of this guy lying on a pool of blood in a restaurant. And I don't know why that came to me. I was in a train going to Normandy, but that stuck with me. And then I wrote a book to figure it out. And that was what Slim and the Beast. It's not really about that, but it came from that, which is about friendship and male intimacy specifically. I was missing my twin brother at the time. First time I didn't really live close to him for years. So it's a kind of philosophical novel about these two young men who decide how they want to live their lives. Are they going to pursue what everyone expects of them, or what do they expect of themselves?
Interesting.
Yeah, it paralleled certainly my kind of moment in life of I was finishing a master's in social theory in London, and I didn't want to do academia, and it kind of bummed me out that I'd gone into student debt for this thing I thought was going to give me all the answers, and it gave me far more questions. But a book came out of it, so that was debt well spent.
When you're writing a book like that, does it often start with an image in your mind?
Yeah. The first novel that no one's ever read, at first they took to the sky. That was the sentence. I don't know why. Of course, I wrote a whole book deciding what that meant to me. Slim and the Beast was a little longer. When I saw him lying in his own pool of blood, all I could think of was that half-eaten burger. So a bit more, there's characters there, right? There's a narrative voice. There's also a different kind of intrigue. And then the third novel is when the sirens began, the professor was sitting at the Astoria Cafe. And that's the Requisitions, really. That's how it begins. So these sentences really do come to me in a sense that not just once, but twice, they keep nagging. And then I have to at least write a paragraph. And then, of course, there's a second paragraph and a third, and then it's 150 pages and then 300. Then you have to edit all, That's a decade for the last one. It took, ironically, what I think 3 months to write the first draft of Slim and the Beast and about 3 years to do the first one of the Requisitions. But Requisitions took a lot more research. That was the culmination of all my academic study. And so, yeah, sentences come to me. That's why I'm excited to see what the next one will be.
Are you a book lover who's always looking for the next best book? Or an avid reader who'd love the chance to ask their favorite author a question? Well, then you might like my other podcast, Storytime in Paris, where I interview writers with a French connection with questions that come from you, the author's fans and followers. Then, the authors treat us to a reading from their books. Listen now to Storytime in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. That's so interesting. Just a phrase that repeats in your head.
Yeah, I heard. I forget who said this. It's I don't think it's Emily Dickinson. It's not Emily Dickinson, but I think it's a 19th century poet, I believe, female poet, who spoke about being out in the meadow wherever she was living and hearing a sentence or a line from a poem on the breeze and literally sprinting home so that she could note it down because she knew that if she didn't write it, someone else would catch it. and that would no longer be her poem.
That's beautiful.
And I believe that. I do think I'm sure have experienced this as an artist too. When you're in certain zeitgeists, you know what you feel like you should write or are onto something, but life gets in the way and you don't really pursue that. And then lo and behold, a couple of years later, some Netflix show, you say, I swore I should have written that, or book comes out. I thought that was my idea. I do. There are kind of, well, City of Muses. I believe in muses, I think they're floating around somewhere in a kind of collective unconscious sense. So it's a matter of being attuned to them as far as being ready to write. And I think that's where all the preparation comes in. Also physical exercise, being mentally but physically ready to do the work. Because when it comes at, it's going to be 10 hours a day for 2 weeks where you just are enamored and you get ready for it.
Well, and you have to be prepared for the parts where you're no longer enamored, but you need to keep going.
Which is a whole large part of, at least half of it.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's years sometimes that go between drafts of a novel, and then the sentence is still there, and you reread it and you say, there is still something that needs to be, gleaned from this. So it's a lifestyle. It is certainly not a career in the American sense.
It's so interesting. I guess that's like the difference between you as a writer and me as a screenwriter, because it's not a sentence that repeats to me. It's a visual that I get that I can't get rid of. Or like I'll be looking, the way that ideas usually come to me is that I'll be looking at something normal and I'll superimpose in my imagination what I think I would like to have happened, or like what would happen if this weird thing happened instead. And it's that image that I can't get out of my head. And I need to write what happens if that thing were to happen.
Oh, wow. That is super curious. So screenplay, from what I understand, I don't write screenplays, but you write very directly, right? You just describe like scene, man sitting on bench, pigeon flying on his shoulder. Like what's the...
Kind of. It's more like mood and atmosphere. So it's partly that, right? Like you don't go into people's mindsets. It's not what they're thinking. It's not ruminating, but you would write like, yeah, a bedraggled man in a gray coat sits holding a cup of coffee that's been cold for 15 minutes. He takes a sip and makes a face, like what you see versus what you think. So you're describing sort of the emotional reactions to things rather than like the thought process that begins them.
That's super cool. I'd love to write a screenplay one day. I've tried before, but I don't think that way,
That's how I feel about novels. I've tried before too, but I can't do it.
Well, you'll adapt a novel and then I'll adapt your screenplay. It'll be
Perfect.
There you go.
A perfect cycle.
Glad we decided on this. Perfect. Yeah.
So how did the name for your first published book become the name for your band?
Pretty simple answer. We went on Facebook when Facebook was still used by people back in 2015 or something, and just kind of said, we've started a band and we've got a couple ideas. Here's a list of them and vote, do one of those click the circle things. I don't know what do you call those
A
things?
poll.
There you go. Yeah. I haven't been focusing on politics recently, so all of the language of politics is a lot. And my brother just suggested, Slim and the Beast. He put it in there because this is it's a very brotherly band with my brother Aaron and then our good friend Aurelian, who I met playing basketball actually. So the novel's about basketball. There's kind of a brotherly connection between us three. Well, why not use this name? And we thought it was kind of curious that Slim and the Beast was a trio, which of course adds to the kind of I don't know if it adds to the marketing. It just made sense for us for whatever reason, because there is a narrative in our music. We wrote, I guess you could say in the past tense now, very singer-songwriter style music that had narrative generally in the songs. And from that Facebook poll onwards, that was Slim and the Beast.
Interesting. Had you and your brother always wanted to be in a band?
We had been in bands before. We went to the University of Vermont together and were in a funk band. Funk, bad funk, like white people. Yeah, it's Vermont, we had some good gigs, but we were called the Sepia Tones.
Sure. That's a good name.
Yeah, it was a good start, and we'd often played in high school, etc., because we've always, been around each other. But it didn't happen in any particular way. Aaron just came to Paris one summer and played with Aurelian and I. Aurelian and I had been working on some songs, and then Aaron had as a singer-songwriter in New Orleans, had a lot of songs. And we just kind of started combining forces, recorded a very rough EP in our friend's bedroom. And then we had a set. And then, you play local gigs, the set grows, people start talking, want to see you at a bigger stage. And it's a long, arduous process with very little money in it, but a lot of fun and life experiences. And then as far as our story went, you sign with a music label who does very little for you and takes a whole lot. And then you realize, oh, the industry's just like every other story we've ever heard about it. And then COVID happened. So we had we had a lot of steps in the road that it was time in 2022, I think, after 7 years, which was a good run. 3 EPs and a lot of great moments to be proud of. One day we'll do a reunion tour, I'm sure, for all you fans out there.
I have your music on my iPhone.
Cool. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm really proud of what we wrote. It was just the creative aspect, especially after working with people for years, especially your twin brother and a close friend. Dynamics are hard to manage regardless, and creative differences and also different moments in life. I had met Augusta, who's now my wife at the time, and I was shifting my perspective into more of kind of like focusing on the next book and wanting to write a different style of music that wasn't so much pop. And not to say that Aaron and Aurelian didn't, but it was just we had different kind of ideas about where the song should go. So once it was hard to make any money because COVID really, our whole European tour was set for March 2020. So we really, and that was kind of the culmination of 7 years of work. So, or 5 years of work at the time. So after that, it was really hard to kind of reconsider how we wanted to build again, because we had to start from scratch essentially after 5 years of hard work. It wasn't the moment, but definitely no regrets. It was a killer time, and you can see we have a lot of fun on the videos on YouTube, and you can find us on all the streaming, all that.
Yeah, and who knows what'll happen in the future.
Exactly.
When you were writing music for Slim and the Beast, were you writing together? Were you writing individually? How did that part work?
So Aaron would write pretty exclusively individually just because he had been a singer-songwriter in New Orleans. And initially he was not in France. So Aurelian and I would work on songs together. Aaron would work on a song. We'd bring it all. And then it would kind of become this chemical reaction where it became the trio's song. And that was awesome. It was kind of split that way. And then Aaron and I one of us would be the lead on the song. Obviously, if it was something, I don't actually think, which would be curious maybe in the future. I never wrote a song that Aaron sang as lead, and nor vice versa. So maybe that's the key.
Yeah, it would be a weird experiment to write for each other and see how that went.
It would. It's kind of funny. I wrote a book about missing my twin brother, and then the book's name became a band that he was in, and then he's now in Paris and no longer needed the band in a sense. If you want to get philosophical about it, he got here, and then as twins, you get on each other's nerves just because you're twins. So combining all of the professional things as well, at a certain point, it became just better for us to focus on our own stuff.
That makes sense. Is he still here in Paris?
He is, and he's doing great work with a band called Fuzz. Great pianist friend of mine, Joe Arena. And he still plays solo too. He's working on some stuff. And he goes by ALB now because he does art by ALB. And then it's cool stuff what he's doing. More kind of like lo-fi hip hop, but with smooth, sultry vocals.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So talk to us a little bit more about your latest book, The Requisitions.
Yeah, so the Requisitions, well, when the sirens began, the professor was sitting at the Astoria Cafe, right? And this Professor Victor Bauman, he sees a woman from across the terrace. You know this story, right? There's a connection between two people. Of course, this connection is occurring at the moment of the invasion of Poland. So I was really interested in thinking about what happens to people in extraordinary circumstances when they want to pursue a possibility, whether it's romantic or professional or otherwise, but life gets in the way or extreme circumstances get in the way. How do you maintain that pursuit, hope, however you want to define it? And it's a book set in Nazi-occupied Poland, really about Victor and Elsa's connection or desire to have one. And then Elsa has a estranged fiance named Carl, who is kind coming with the German army, and that has its own narrative. So there's really three narratives that are interwoven of these three characters about how they navigate the occupation of Poland in three distinct scenarios. Victor being, of course, will end up being a prisoner, in the ghetto in Łódź in Poland. Elsa will be forced to work for the Gestapo, and Karl is, of course, working for the German army. So that's the basic idea. It is more unique in the sense that it's narrated by someone very much like me. So my whole obsession with the history of World War II since I was a child, I get into that from the outset is how have I always been interested in this and why? And the only way I've ever been able to make sense of it is through this novel, a story of Victor and Elsa. So I kind of rubber band between the contemporary world of a narrator trying to make sense of the past and the difference between history and memory, and then the fictional narrative of Victor, Elsa, and Karl.
It's so interesting. Yeah, I was reading because really there are four characters, right? Because it's described as a metafiction. So the narrator is another fourth character. Exactly. And I was actually, I rewrote the book during COVID, and I had to make it make sense to me because I realized I was writing it too traditionally, and I'm not a historical fiction writer. That's not my style, but I did see this as a book set in history. So I finally figured out how to do it in a way that made sense to me, which is classic. I now know only I could have written this, not because it's necessarily a great novel, just because it's my perspective and my relationship to my mother and memory and history. And it had to be that personal in order for it to work, because otherwise it would just have been another book about World War II, which is fine. But there are a lot of those. Yeah, exactly. That's really interesting because it seems like the main thing, like the main hook, the main point of interest of this book is that it has the narrator as part of it. So it's interesting to me that is not something that you started with. Yeah. Well, ask a novelist to give you an elevator pitch. They'll fail pretty much every time. But it's funny that even the term metafiction, I think people get allergic to certain words. But it's true. I mean, the book opens, each section that leads to the past and the history is the narrator discussing some connection to the present moment. So there are really, it's true, four characters. I don't know if my next novel will have three interwoven narratives written from the perspective of a fourth person, but it was a great exercise and a challenge, and I'm happy with how it turned out. So. Is it something that would interest you again to insert yourself or to insert a narrator back into the book? Yeah, I do like metafiction as a general genre, and it just makes sense for me in my head. Now that I hear it when I write, especially in the past months, just writing new stuff, it's kind of a voice that comes naturally to me, which is what every writer looks for, is just a voice that is there. So I'm sure it will return. I'm sure there will be other periods in history that I'll be interested in that might write about, but who knows? Yeah, it's interesting too. I was going to ask you about, because I know the narrator, I was able to read the first few pages of your book on your Substack. So yeah, sure. I know that the narrator was obsessed as a small child with World War II. So I was going to ask you about your own childhood, which you've already answered. And I was going to ask you how much of yourself we're meant to read into the narrator. However much you want to read, there is definitely a lot of fictional elements to it because it's a book and a narrative that I wanted to make sense and to have a lot of, it's inevitably layered just because I've written a lot of drafts of it. So there are certainly, it's the classic question of fiction, right? Even with Slim and the Beast, there's a character that ends up putting a lot of paint into a pond and jumping into it to create a splash that she takes a photo of as a kind of surrealist art, but she dies one day because she doesn't gauge the depth. And somebody asked me, did that really happen? I was like, no, but thank you for believing that it might, Yeah, there are a lot of aspects of the narrator that are me, the most honest ones, of course. The events surrounding the narrator, especially in the relationship to the mother, are fictionalized. I love my mom, and she's a very different person than the mother in the book, but not that the narrator doesn't love his mom, but but yeah, there's certainly, like any good novelist, I'll say, yeah, however much you want to read into it. Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. I was reading somewhere that you have struggled in the past, as I think a lot of artists have, with the idea of working alone in a creative space and then needing to market yourself in a public one. And you said once, I read that you said, though you spend thousands of hours by yourself, you have to separate your words from your own ego. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you still struggle with?
Sure. Especially with a book out, and that's kind of the irony, is you spend so many years on something and then it's finally not of you anymore. It's just the book, and then you can move on. You know how it is with projects. I think artists feel this way, is once it's out in the world, it's not of me anymore. I mean, it's just a thing. It's its own thing. And then trying to act really excited and tell people it's new and you should read it. And I definitely think that it's worth putting on your bookshelf. I just don't know if that's really up to the artist. I'm kind of a traditionalist in that sense, where the role I think we have is to find the time and the energy to create and to put those creations out into the world, and hopefully people will buy it. But in this, I mean, I don't make a living off my art. I'd like to, but it's not my goal, and that allows me to not overly care, maybe to a fault at sometimes. I mean, sure, I could have done a lot more with my first novel to market it differently and all the et cetera. I just didn't want to. I wanted to write a new book, which was what I did. I started the Requisitions instead of going on kind of a PR campaign thing. So separating the words from the ego, I do in some sense feel much more comfortable now with my own self and my own sense of self as a writer. So I am, in that sense, paradoxically more capable of being out in public, so to speak. Substack has been great for that. It's a digital presence, but it's still, I find I feel comfortable and authentic in how I present myself there. And what's great about that, it's about the work, not the personality. That's the thing I really hate in this era of celebrity, is that the personality is supposed to be as important as the creation. And I just don't believe that. And I think that inevitably, if you focus on your ego and marketing yourself, regardless of the intention, the more you focus on the ego, the more egotistical you'll become. And when it comes to making good art, that's got to be far away. I mean, the ego, it plays a part in anything because we have it. But if you're constantly selling yourself, then that's going to infect your writing. I'm convinced of it. So yeah, I'm not as kind of bummed about the reality. I just choose not to, for better and for worse. But that's why I do podcasts with interesting creatives that actually are doing the work themselves and are doing them for the right reasons, which in this era, it increasingly seems like it can be hard to find.
Yeah, it's a difficult balance. I admire people who are able to just turn on the camera and sell themselves and sell their content and all of that. And it's not that I don't think that I'm interesting and charming, because I do think I'm both of those things, but I can't just turn it on. It's draining for me. So just like you, I feel like sometimes it's to a detriment, but I just can't.
Yeah, I mean, your use of the word draining, I think, is very apt, because there's a finite resource, the energy we have to create. And I think, when you're doing content creation, for example, to market your art, that's part of the same energy store. So wherever you put it, especially as you get older, it's getting taken from somewhere else. And for me, that's kind of where I landed, was if it takes too much energy to post stories every day and to do the writing on Substack that sells my book more than it actually feels like I'm just saying something I need to say into the world, then I'm becoming my own PR team, which is a choice, and that's fine. And then I should think about it as a job, and then it's art to make money versus whatever other reason we do this, which I like to think is more kind of just, it's not even esoteric. It's just like, if I don't play basketball, I get frustrated. If I don't make art, I get frustrated.
So you also hold literary salons here in Paris. Can you tell us a little bit about what those are?
Yeah, it's so my friend John Baxter, he's a prolific author. I think he just published his 48th book this year. He's film biographer historically, but he's also written novels and a lot of nonfiction about the history of Paris. So John and I just get together on Zoom, and in a month-long period, once a week on Sundays, we read a book and talk about it with whoever wants to sign up for it. There's always a theme. So last month's theme was Montmartre. So we did a book by Q Miaojin. She's a Taiwanese author called Last Words from Montmartre. She is a young woman that actually killed herself right after writing this book. It's kind of a suicide note in a way, but it's very beautiful, poetic. She had an interesting philosophy about life, and it was never heard of it before, but we discovered this book, and then we read Jules Simenon, a kind of hard-boiled detective novel about a murder in Montmartre, and that was fun in a different way. So we contextualize the books a bit. I make slides, and we talk about the biography of the author and some of the kind of intersectionality of the books and also the themes. But it's really just an excuse to read books we wouldn't necessarily otherwise read with people who want to talk about it. And we've been doing that since, we just did the 12th salon over a couple of years now. It's, I think, December 2020 we started. Really a way to make a little extra cash during COVID as two writers who had no real future in tour guiding at the time. So it's been great. It's just, I've read, whatever, you do the math, 36 books or more that I don't think ever otherwise have read. So it's a good excuse to keep the machine oiled.
I love that. I love anything that gets me to read something that I wouldn't normally gravitate towards.
Yeah, in this era especially, it's so hard that it's a muscle like anything else. And it, I think, has been attacked more than any other muscle, is the reading muscle in the last 20 years. So it's good to keep that in mind as we continue.
Yeah. All right. So here's a big question. How do you think that Paris has either helped or hindered your growth as an artist?
Oh, great. Easy. Helped in every way, and then hindered in, there's probably more glasses of wine drunk in Paris than any other city in the world. No, I think Paris has been consistently, it's in some ways it's a revolving door city for a lot of people, wanderers and people who come as a pilgrimage. Whether they last is really dependent on a lot of things, from papers to finance. Well, not so much finances. I don't think it's an expensive city compared to a lot of the big cities in the world. It's really inspired me, especially because it's a revolving door city. You meet a lot of new people at different chapters in your life. And I've had, I think, in my 14 years in Paris, 5 different chapters that I can really consider chapters. You know, my first relationship, and then the first novel, and then the second relationship, and the second novel. And you can see a pattern, right? I'm married now, so I expect this one to last quite a while. But no, Paris, anytime you're lacking inspiration, you walk outside. It's really a cliche, but it's as simple as that. And on the other side of it, the social life can be a hindrance, because I do get a lot of energy from people and artists and going to gigs and museums and drinking wine afterwards, talking to people about it. And, you know, alcohol is a drug like any other drug. I do think in Paris, it kind of is a natural state of existence for a lot of artists to just have weekly hangs, and that can become just taxing on both the body but also your brain, because socially, if you're always out, you're, again, the resource of energy is finite. Maybe not so much in my 20s, but now I'm 36, so I start to see if I give my energy fully to 3 walks in the week with clients, and that's a 3-hour walk where I'm talking in depth about historical things, and then I have 3 nights out to various vernissages, and then I want to find time to write and be with myself. It's like putting on a Seinfeld rerun and a cup of tea also sounds really nice. I admire people like John Baxter, different generation, who just say, why would you, just go write? I mean, or read and write. Those are the things that's what back in my day, that was the video game or the TV, and now I have video games and TV. So it's definitely a discipline in some sense, but Paris has been certainly much more of a inspiration than a hindrance, and I don't intend to leave. So yeah, it's home.
You were telling me last time we spoke about your next project. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah, so I mentioned her in this conversation. Augusta Sagnelli, she's my wife. She's a fantastic photographer from Connecticut. She spent a lot of time in New Orleans, which is how we kind of met through a mutual connection in Paris in March, Leap Day 2020. So
wow.
Days before the world shut down. But what we're working on is that when we met, she went back to New Orleans. We experienced lockdowns from our respective homes. I had a platonic connection, nothing romantic initially, but we started texting each other. And long story short, after 400,000 words of text messages, because I have that document, we decided to see if falling in love digitally actually was a real thing. And I flew to the US in August 2020. We spent 2 weeks quarantined in a cabin in New York. And of course, decided we were actually in love. And then she moved to Paris in March 2021 after we got married in her parents' backyard. So what we're working on is the nonfiction tale based on our text messages and diary entries from that time, from both of our perspectives, of how to fall in love, really. I mean, that may even be the title. That's a very cool project to work, of course, with a partner, but also it allows space for creativity in the sense that we have the words. It's a matter of compiling and structuring it. And it's also cool just in a relationship to be able to say, oh, look, this is what we made, and this is the first 4 years. We just celebrated our first year anniversary after the fourth year because of Leap Day,
Sure. Happy anniversary.
Thank you very much. And then that's a thing, and then we can move on and create other adventures. You don't want to be the old couple that says, oh, remember how we fell in love? And no, let's make up some new adventures too. We'll have a book to remember how we fell in love.
Sure, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the old couple that remembers how they fell
No,
in love.
I want to be the old couple.
Yeah.
So I hope I remember how we fell in love. Otherwise, I'll have a book to remind me.
Yeah. All right. So where can people find you? How can people keep up to date with what is going on in your world?
Yeah, the best, easiest way is on my website, SamuélLopez-Barrantes.com. I also write on Substack frequently. So that's If Not Paris at Substack. Between those two places, you'll find everything you need to know. And I will say that I printed 300 copies of the Requisitions. I did a limited print run. Augusta and I created our imprint to do it independently so we can control our profits, because we've talked about this. Artists, I think, are screwed by various systems. So it's time for us to take some of the control back. But that means I think there's, as of now, 95 copies remaining. And once those are gone, that edition will not exist. There will be another edition, of course. But if you're interested in the first one, then hopefully you'll hear this before they run out. Otherwise, you'll get the second edition, which will also be a pretty unique one that I'll number as well, so that at each successive step, it is kind of its own object. So that's where I'm at.
Very cool. All right. Well, I will include links to all of that so people can find you and your book and grab their last few copies of your first edition.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. It was so nice speaking with you. Thank you for taking the time.
It's a pleasure, Jennifer.
Thank you for listening to City of Muses. If you've liked what you heard, please take a moment to rate and review it. This is the fastest and easiest way to help support the podcast. Tell a friend who could use a little inspiration. You can also subscribe to the Paris Underground Radio newsletter over on our website, parisundergroundradio.com, which comes out every Sunday and gives a little peek into what's on the network for the week ahead. I'm your host, Jennifer Geraghty. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and may you find inspiration wherever you go. City of Muses was produced by Jennifer Geraghty for Paris Underground Radio.